Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Hail State Debate. It is just me, Brett, flying solo on this episode. The reason for that is, as you can see from the stuff behind me, we are getting ready for our high school debate tournament this weekend. And then after that, we have our national tournament the weekend after that. So we are just jammed up 8 different ways. And so I have to apologize. This video is going to be a little bit shorter than some of our others, but we do actually have a lot of good information on the topic, which is, of course, resolved. Predictive policing is unjust. And so even if it is a shorter, slightly less formal video, we wanted to get at least our best quality stuff out there, maybe not as much quantity, so hopefully you can have some unique advantages. As always, the links and the timestamps will be in the notes below. If it is useful to you, consider maybe telling a friend, maybe like, maybe subscribe. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, we are at Hail State Debate, where you can get our thoughts on life, on debate, on topics, on things like that. We would love to have you join us there. Forgive my voice. Also, another apology I have to give you. I was out the other night yelling, like looking for my dog. She got out in the yard and I was like yelling, trying to get her back in. Don't worry about her. She's a 105-pound Great Pyrenees named Theodosia. She was in no danger whatsoever. It was the other dogs that were in danger, and now everything is fine. So with that, talking a little bit about predictive policing, we'll try to go kind of quickly. I'm going to first, as always, do my initial thoughts. Then we'll talk about definitions, framework, values, and criteria. And then finally, we will move on to the affirmative and then to the negative. So for initial thoughts, a couple that I have. The first one is kind of obvious, which is this is a fraught, charged topic, obviously. Predictive policing and all issues of policing in the United States today have dimensions that deal with economic class, that of course deal with race and ethnicity, that deal with like immigration status and things like that. So you have to be extremely sensitive in the way you talk about this topic. That's a given. I think we all know that. But in addition, I think you have to be sensitive on the other side because, I, in my prior work as a private practice lawyer, actually represented police officers in a lot of cases. And, I think most of the people that will be judging you at most tournaments, particularly if you're at more local tournaments, if you're trying to qualify for NSDA or something with this, are going to be people who don't reflexively think of police as bad folks, nor should they. It's not been my experience at all. So when you are talking about things like racial bias and you are talking about things like injustice, you have to be careful not to frame that in terms where somebody could say, oh, well, you're just saying that police are bad or individual police are just, inherently racist or anything like that. You have to be careful to talk about the fact that these are flaws in the system, not necessarily accusations of particular officers. So when we're talking about these issues of bias, we're talking about systemic racism. We're not talking about any individual particular person. So keep that in mind. Be sensitive to both sides, right? We're talking about police officers, not cops, right? We're going to be respectful in the terms we use. And when we have to criticize anyone, we're going to do it in a professional way. So don't forget that. Now, the other interesting thing about this topic is that it really requires you to have sort of 2 wildly different sets of knowledge to be successful. It's such a short resolution, right? It just has 2 things in it: predictive policing and unjust. In other words, you're asked to assess predictive policing, and then you're asked to assess the question of what is just, which is a huge question in philosophy. So on the one hand, you're going to be asked to have an evidence-based understanding of a lot of highly technical, technology-driven subject matter, right? The different products that are out there, how they predict things, what we know about them and what we don't know, the fact that there's a lot of missing information because a lot of these systems are not very transparent, and you do need to have a strong understanding of that. You're going to want to become at least a little bit familiar with what is an algorithm, right? What is machine learning, right? How do these things work? How do they take data points that the police collect in various ways and put them together to make a predictive picture of, for example, what neighborhoods are likely to see more crime, what individuals may be more likely to commit crime. And you need to have at least a basic level understanding of how these things happen. It can't just be that it's like a magical black box that you can't see inside of, because when you get into fights about how this works, particularly in front of judges who've never seen anything about this before, right? You're going to need to be, conversant and persuasive. And by the way, this is a topic that many judges will not have heard anything about before. It's not like, debating about something, like, for example, just sort of general racial profiling and policing. That's something we all know about. Predictive policing is a subject that, many people just don't talk about and don't know about. So you're going to have to be ready to explain it. But if the only thing you do is understand the technical aspects and the statistics and the data and what is an algorithm and all that stuff, you're going to be missing the other half of the resolution. And I really do believe that the word unjust and the question of justice is half of the resolution. And that's sort of at the other end of the skill set for us as LD debaters, right? I mean, you have to be ready to articulate a coherent theory of what is just and what is unjust. And this is arguably like the most loaded, complex question in all of moral philosophy. There are many different radically, sometimes diametrically opposed ideas of what, justice really even means. And you're going to need to be ready to discuss that and explain the difference, as we'll talk about in a minute, between like libertarian justice, right, versus an idea of like communitarian or constitutive justice versus Rawlsian justice. These all lead to radically different results, and you're going to have to be debating about like the framework for what justice is. If you just walk in and say, yeah, predictive policing has good or bad outcomes, and you don't understand how to frame that within, what does it mean to be just, you're going to be super vulnerable. So those are my two big thoughts. I think it's a fairly straightforward topic. It should be a lot of fun. There's a lot to talk about. So without further ado, we will move on and talk a little bit about the definitions and the framing of the resolution, as well as potential values and criteria. Okay, so starting out on definitions, obviously we need to define predictive policing. I think the important thing here is not to get confused and to believe that we're just talking about making predictions in police work. That's something, as we're going to talk about later on the negative, that has been going on since like the beginning of policing, right? It's been going on as long as we have had police departments in this country and even other countries, and it's something that will always have to happen. And that actually raises some interesting strategic opportunities for the negative, right? But predictive policing, of course, is a term of art, right? It's something that where we take the words and they have a special meaning together that is different than just saying define predictive and define policing, right? And it refers to the use of information technology like algorithms, statistical modeling, geospatial mapping tools, and things like that. In other words, computers and complicated math to try to predict where crime will happen in the future, who might do it, and to try to intervene in ways that hopefully prevent it. So one thing you're definitely not going to want to do and want to push back on if an opponent does it is to define predictive and then define policing. You're going to want to look for some good literature-based definitions that are out there, right? And so what are some of the options? Well, one that's really good is the Rand Corp study from 2013. Rand just says that predictive policing is the application of analytical techniques, particularly quantitative techniques like numbers, to identify likely targets for police intervention and prevent crime or solve past crimes by making statistical predictions. And so that's a really good sort of short summary of what's going on. But even better, in that same Rand article, they offer what's sort of called a taxonomy of predictive methods. And they say that there are multiple different things that predictive policing generally tries to predict. And I think it's important to be aware of all the different ways in which it's used. If you're only talking in your case about predictions about who might be, a violator and who should be, arrested, then you're going to have a rough time. So the Rand taxonomy says that there are sort of four types. So when we look to the Rand taxonomy, there's four things they're looking at. Number one, methods for predicting crimes, like where are crimes likely to happen, in a particular neighborhood. Number two, methods for predicting offenders. This is going to be your most, I think, controversial type of prediction, like people we think are going to be criminals in the future, and we go and talk to them and try to warn them out of it, right? That's certainly one of the more troubling types of predictive policing for most people. Then number three, methods for predicting perpetrators' identities. This is simply someone has already committed a crime, and then we're using statistical models to try to figure out who they might be based on just machine learning and AI and things like that to try to track down the suspect. This seems a little odd to call it predictive policing because it's trying to find out who did something in the past, but the Rand Corporation definition includes it because you're using statistical models to make a prediction as to who this person would be, I guess. Right? And then the last one is methods for predicting victims of crime, trying to profile people who are likely to be subject to crimes and maybe do things to intervene or help them in various ways, right? And I actually think that the negative might gain some value out of actually potentially reading this breakdown of different types of predictive policing, because it allows you to make the argument, Judge, there are so many different functions of predictive policing, and the AF has the burden of showing you that they are categorically bad, right, or categorically unjust. So, if you're the neg and you can win the idea that there are four different kinds of predictive policing, and your opponent has a burden to at least to make arguments that address all of them, and then, the affirmative gets up and does nothing but talk about, targeting individual people and profiling them as potential criminals or targeting specific neighborhoods, you can say, Judge, they haven't met their burden, right? They haven't talked about all the different forms of predictive policing, or they haven't at least grouped them together, right? Now, there are arguments against that, but I think the idea on the negative that you want to show that this is a broad array of different things that have different functions and work in different ways is a really good one, and I would certainly consider it, right? And if the AF is overwhelming reading evidence about predicting crimes, you can say, look, her entire case was about one of the four types of predictive policing. The the other three haven't been touched, you can't say that something is unjust if only one species of multiple species has even been addressed in the case, right? And I think that's a potentially a beneficial idea for the negative, right? Now, if you want an alternative definition that's a little more focused on the data side of things, Major in 2019 has this definition that says predictive policing is the collection and analysis of data about previous crimes for identification and statistical prediction of individuals or geospatial areas with an increased probability of criminal activity to help develop policing intervention and prevention strategies. So, a little bit more focused on the technical side of things if you really want to emphasize that, right? Now, one important thing we're going to be talking about a little bit later is understanding how predictive policing is different from what police have been doing in the past, right? Because police have been making predictions about where crime happens, as I said earlier, for as long as there's been policing, right? You didn't, say, back in the 1980s or the 1970s, just jump in a police car and go drive around randomly on your patrol. You looked at information about where crime had happened, little pins and tacks on the map usually, right? And you planned your patrols around those. You didn't just go randomly, surveilling a house. You looked at intel about that made it seem likely that the suspect might be at that particular house. So predictions have been happening forever. So it's really important for the affirmative and for the negative as well to understand the differences here, because I think a good negative would basically make the argument, and we'll talk about ways to do this later, that predictive policing is just a somewhat more precise and arguably potentially a more scrutinizable, right, more checkable version of the sort of hunches that police have been using forever. So if there is bias in it, right, and there may be bias in it, we're certainly going to argue as the AF that there's bias. At least in this case, the bias isn't completely within the brain of the police officer. It's out in an algorithm somewhere where it might be able to be checked, right? Now, the next term, and I don't want to sleep on this, is. Right now, you might forget to define this, but there's one detail that's worth mentioning. Is a present tense verb. So like one potential argument that I think the affirmative might make is that because is a present tense verb, we have to evaluate predictive policing as it exists in the present tense. And you could use this to undercut, for example, a negative that runs an argument that says, well, there are ways to improve predictive policing, right? So if a negative comes in with a counter plan and says, well, I can think of ways predictive policing can be done better, your response would be, this is not a policy resolution. This is a straight up value resolution. It makes a statement about what something is, right now in the present tense. So your counter plan is invalid, right? Because we don't get to discuss what it might be one day or what it could be under different circumstances. We're here to assess as it currently exists today with what we know about it today. I think this is a strong point for the AF. Have we demonstrated that it is just? And if not, we're going to say that it's unjust, right? So that leads to, I think the second really, really important term in the resolution, which is unjust, right? And as I said earlier, just a second ago, this is not your typical we ought to do this language, right? It channels the debate more toward a philosophical fight as opposed to a policy fight. A long time ago, Lincoln Douglas resolutions used to look like this a lot. They used to say X is Y, right? Something is unjust or unfair or whatever. And we've sort of gotten into kind of quasi-policy resolutions over the last few decades, but this is kind of a throwback, right? So I think by putting unjust as opposed to, just we shouldn't do this, right? We should abolish it or whatever. It really channels the debate toward a philosophical fight about what justice means. And that's almost as important as how predictive policing works. I really think it is half the battle, as they used to say on the old G.I. Joe cartoons when I was a kid. And that may throw some people off, right? Because in many traditional areas, and even in some of your kind of more traditional progressive hybrid areas, there are tons of debaters who are just not interested in really getting into debates about philosophy and values and about what justice means, right? You might get a couple of half-hearted sentences when they're reading their value and their criterion, but they don't really want to get into a deep down fight about what it means to be just and what different theories of justice are, right? But justice is such a robust concept in philosophy. If you're willing to take a minute in your case, right, and spend a few hours in your preparation on this resolution to really set up a strong framework for what just or unjust behavior is, you can really put your opponent at a huge disadvantage. For example, if you run a libertarian justice case and load up on some good cards and good blocks to back it up, and your opponent just sort of ignores the value, he just comes in or she just comes in and sort of talks about why predictive policing is generically good, well, you may be in a position where you can say, Judge, I gave you this very elaborate framework of libertarianism or communitarianism or whatever it is, right? My opponent didn't really touch the framework. I've won the framework debate. all of her, sort of generic utilitarian arguments about good and bad do not link to my framework. They have nothing to do with whether from a communitarian perspective or a libertarian perspective this is good. And if you're prepared to do that and set up a case that way, and you go up against debaters who are just not eager to debate philosophy, it can be, a big advantage, right? So it's just super important to think about different framings of justice. If you just run in and say, predictive policing reduces crime, or predictive policing increases racial bias, and you don't take the time to frame it within a coherent theory of justice, you're going to be super vulnerable to a well-prepared philosophy debater. So really quickly before we move on, let's talk about some basic conceptions of justice that you might consider applying to the case, right? So one we just talked about, it's a little bit of a fringy kind of thing, but libertarian justice. Right? Libertarian justice comes from various people like Robert Nozick and folks like that. And it's the idea that justice is just maximizing individual liberty while you still keep society functioning, right? So, the argument would be that stockpiling data about people to potentially profile them as criminals or victims or their neighborhoods as places that are in need of suspicion is a restriction on liberty. We've done without it before. We don't need it. If we're libertarians, we believe that we should not be profiling people in this way. That's one option. Another would be the idea of justice as individual desert. And I don't mean dessert, like what you eat after dinner. I mean desert as in what an individual person deserves, right? And this is just a concept that says when we talk about justice, we are necessarily talking about what an individual person deserves. And this has a lot of intuitive value. I mean, think about it. When we put people on trial for a crime, and by the way, I should say, predictive policing is not used, obviously, as something where we convict someone of a crime. I've seen people talking about the movie Minority Report as an example of like predictive policing. It's a dystopian alternate future version where we actually convict people of crimes based on like psychic predictions of whether they will commit them. We don't do that with predictive policing, of course. What happens with predictive policing is we send more police to your neighborhood. They may come to your door and knock on your door and say, hey, in so many words, we're concerned about you, that you might be a criminal, you might want to be careful. They might come and find potential victims and say, you need to be more careful. Things along those lines. Nobody actually goes to jail, but as we're going to talk about later, these are major impositions that make life less free, that result in profiling and things like that. But at any rate, regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's a conviction or how you're handled on the street by police officers, there's a belief that justice means you get what you deserve, right? So for example, if the teacher comes in and says that one person was talking and therefore everybody gets a 0 on the test, well, I think most people would say that's not justice, right? That may be some rough form of justice, but it's not real justice, right? And similarly, if we have these sort of blippy points in a statistical model that say, well, this neighborhood looks a little more dangerous, so we're just going to send in more police marching the streets and stopping people regularly and profiling residents of this neighborhood, most people would say that is not a just way of treating people. And you get this from like small L classical liberal philosophers. So Professor John Hospers back in 1985 writes this. I think this is a very good card on it. Justice depends on desert, and desert is a matter of past performance, not of future possibilities. The grade a student deserves in a course depends upon his past record of achievement in the course. If a man, and by the way, this is all, gender neutral. This is from 1985. They use the male pronouns and stuff like that. But, if a man deserves a punishment for a crime, it is because that person committed a crime in the past, not because, for example, it would be useful to punish him as a scapegoat. Well, that's pretty on the nose we're not literally punishing them, but that's pretty on the nose as to what we're talking about here. Punishing the innocent is always unjust, nor is it just to punish him because he might commit a crime in the future. Preventative detentions of persons believed to be dangerous is sometimes used as a utilitarian measure to prevent the commissions of crime in the future, but this is done from considerations of utility, not of justice, right? And so this is the idea that unless you're getting a tailored version of what you actually deserve for your actual conduct, it might be utilitarian, it might be helpful, it might make society safer, but it's not justice. And that's an important distinction. You can say, Judge, we're not talking about whether this makes society better. That's not the question. That's not what the resolution says. The question is whether it's just to stop a person on the street because you have some statistical aggregate data that suggests that they might be a criminal, but you haven't actually seen them do anything that's criminal or suggests criminal behavior, right? That's not just, because it's not based on them as an individual, right? And I think this is a fantastic AF framework. If you win that framework, right, that you have to treat people as individuals, that's basically the round, right? Because as soon as the judge agrees that, okay, we've got to base our treatment of people on like how they actually behave, well, predictive policing doesn't do that. It treats people as statistical data points within a larger model and probabilities rather than individuals. So I like that one a lot. There's obviously Rawlsian distributive justice. This is the greatest benefits to the least advantaged in society, right? We're going to make sure we protect the least advantaged first. This is probably a good go-to theory for the AF, although you might even try it with the negative if you think you can pull off arguments about how predictive policing reduces crime, although those are kind of few and far between. And the last one I'll talk about would be constitutive justice. This is sort of a version of kind of sort of like postmodernism. This comes from Henry and Milanovich in 1999. And they talk about how justice within the context of the criminal justice system, which is what we're debating about here, looks at, it only looks in the status quo at like certain crimes that are often kind of racially coded, like blue collar crimes, as opposed to just the injustice of how society as a whole works and how it tries to control the behavior of certain people. And if you want to be really just, you have to look at both. You don't just look at whether somebody got, mugged or murdered. You look at whether society is imposing controls on groups of people that affect and the way they live their lives and take away their options, right? So these are all outstanding potential theories. They're going to involve very, very different cases, right? An individual justice case is going to focus on my rights as an individual to be treated based on what I did, whereas a constitutive or like communitarian justice case is going to focus on the aggregate effects. Now, one important question to ask, because this is kind of the default way we argue in a lot of debate rounds, is what about utilitarianism? Right? Can I use utilitarianism? And more specifically, even if I don't read utilitarianism as like a value and a criterion, can I come in and still talk in a justice-based round? Can I come in and still talk about like whether the effects of predictive policing are good or bad for the community, right? And I think you can. Certainly you can use Rawlsian justice. Rawls looks at different effects that things have. You can look at constitutive justice and things like that, absolutely. And you can even look to utilitarianism itself because, there's a lot of philosophy out there that says that like justice and utilitarianism are diametrically opposed, right? So justice is what I deserve, right? I have a right to this no matter what because it is fair. I have a right to live. You can't kill me because, you'd like to divide up my stuff among other people and I'm a rich person, you want to take my money. Utilitarianism, says that, well, if you want to make an omelet, you might have to break a few eggs. Innocent people might have to suffer on occasion for the greater good of the collective whole. And so there's an argument out there that utilitarianism and justice are diametrically opposed. Like utilitarianism ignores, individual justice, and justice stands in the way of utilitarianism. Well, John Stuart Mill, who's kind of viewed as like one of the key founding fathers of utilitarianism, actually said, no, that's not true. In, chapter 5 of his book, Utilitarianism, he basically says that when we talk about rights, right, all we really mean is something that you have a valid claim for society from. So whatever you're justly entitled to is what you can claim from society. And he says, like, how can we weigh the different competing interests and decide what people are entitled to except through utilitarianism? Yes, you have rights. And yes, there is such a thing as justice, but the way we determine what is just has got to be done by weighing the cost and benefits for everybody and deciding who is better off and what is best. So I do think you can come in with utilitarian arguments, but you need to be careful about how you frame them. You need to be ready, for example, if you want to cite Rawls or you want to read a little bit from John Stuart Mill, because if you just run in the front door and start talking about statistics about how we're going to lower crime or we're going to increase racial profiling, a good opponent will say something along the lines of, that's not what this is about. This is supposed to be about justice, not about pure utility, and you need to be able to answer that. A couple of other quick framework questions about plans and counter plans. I really don't think on this resolution you need to have anything like a plan on the AF because, again, it's a value statement. It's not a policy statement, right? You're not asked to pick a particular type of predictive policing, nor do I think you can. I don't think you're you're able to sort of choose one over others, I think what you have to say is like, this is a general moral statement about the qualities of predictive policing. And I certainly don't think you're, in a position to offer a counter plan, although you might be able to argue instead that, there are ways in which predictive policing can be done that are not bad. There are ways that it's being done now that are not bad. And so you can't make a categorical statement. But I don't think this is something where you can pick out a specific advocacy or run a specific plan, because it's literally not phrased as a policy resolution, right? So with that, let's take a quick look at values and criteria. I really don't have a whole lot to add here. I think obviously most people are going to default really hard to a value of justice, since that's what the resolution says, right? The resolution talks about justice, and you could do other things like morality, but why would you? You're just going to be adding another inferential step, right, that you have to argue in your case. So usually when the resolution specifies a value, you go with it, and I think justice is perfectly fine here. The real question is, what is your criterion for justice? And that kind of goes back to all these different theories that we talked about a little bit earlier. What is going to be your theory of justice? And you need to spend a lot of time thinking about that, but we've given you some good options already, so just be aware of that. But I think that, those questions have kind of already been addressed in the video. So with that, we will take just a quick 5-second break and then come back and talk a little bit about affirmative arguments. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the AF. And like I said earlier, y'all, we are going to focus on stuff that, frankly, not the stuff you're going to see everywhere else. If you buy any of the commercial briefs, they've got tons of good stuff. They really do, about just sort of literature and cards you can read about, for example, racial profiling, about how the evidence shows that it doesn't work. We're going to focus on 3 or 4 arguments on each side that I think are a little bit novel, that you can use, hopefully, to have a little bit of an advantage. We'll talk about those things, but we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time just sort of doling out the sort of basic cards on it this time, just because we're really pressed for time, and I'm super sorry, but thank y'all so much for your patience on it. And obviously for the next resolution, which I guess will be NSDA Nationals, we will be back to full strength, but we appreciate y'all understanding in this particular case. So the first thing I have for the AF, and I really think this is a good sort of, it's a framing tool, but it's also a contention, which would be the idea that the burden is really on proponents of predictive policing to show that it is not biased and that it is not harmful, and that if the evidence is not clear, you should default to the AF, right? And this idea is the idea is that predictive policing is rooted in algorithms and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all these complex mathematical tools that are either owned by police departments and created by police departments, or they are owned and created by private firms. And in most cases, the only people who are actually able to see how these things work and break them down and look at them are the people that created them and own them, either private companies or police departments. And there's plenty of evidence out there that you can look at. If you just Google, predictive policing non-transparent, you can find tons of evidence out there about how these things are not transparent and they're not publicly available. Well, you know what? When we approve drugs, we make the manufacturer prove that they are safe before they can sell them. When you sell appliances like dishwashers, the manufacturer has to prove that they meet energy efficiency standards before they can sell them. And it really shouldn't be any different with predictive policing software and systems, right, that are going to potentially abridge people's rights. They're going to be, they have been shown through evidence to be, disproportionately targeting communities of color and potentially perpetuating systemic bias. You should have to, if you want to use one of these systems, you ought to have to prove that it's not biased, that it isn't perpetuating these problems. And if you don't have enough evidence to do that, then you should default to the affirmative and say that they are unjust. In other words, if you want to make this part of the justice system, right, then you ought to have to prove that it is not systemically biased, right? And so, at the end of the round, if you're not persuaded by the evidence, default to the AF. And the ACLU in 2016 had a really good, blurb about this, which is that, a lack of transparency about predictive policing systems prevents a meaningful, well-informed public debate. At the end of the round, if we were giving people a certain criminal penalty and we didn't know whether it was racist, or if we had a court system and we didn't know whether it was biased, we would say, whoa, we need to put a hold on that. We can't risk it. This is why we have so many appeals in the criminal justice process, right? And so the idea would be, put the burden onto the negative effectively to show that it is not biased. If there's any doubt, you ought to default toward the affirmative, because at the end of the day, you guys control the data, right? You guys who do this control the data. If you're not willing to show us the data, then we can't just sit here and assume it's just and assume it's fair, right? So, in other words, whether you use this as a contention or maybe an observation or a framework or whatever, whether you use the ACLU card or something else about non-transparency, I think it is really important because what this does is it can take a mediocre contention that says something like, well, sometimes predictive policing leads to bias. And instead it can say categorically across the board, you can't show, there is some evidence that leads to bias and you don't have any evidence to refute it conclusively. So if there's a risk of bias, if there's a risk of racial, profiling and things along those lines, we cannot use this, right? And I think because it's the justice system, right? And it's supposed to be fair and it's supposed to be even-handed. There's a gut level argument that I think a lot of judges would buy that you really ought to have to prove it before you use it, right? A next idea that I think is really good is the idea of bad data in, bad data out. In other words, garbage in, garbage out. If we put bad data into these systems, they're going to give us, bad results. So DJ Pangburn in 2019 has a good article about the low quality of data that is fed into many predictive policing systems, right? So first, he explains that a lot of data in predictive policing systems that they use to predict crimes is based on the same biased assumptions that police have always used. He writes, police data can be biased in two distinct ways, right? First, police data reflects police practices and policies, and if a group or geographic area is disproportionately targeted for unjustified police contacts and actions, this group or area will be overrepresented in the data. So in other words, if you are using data about crime that is rooted in the fact that you've been heavily policing a neighborhood for decades, right? Well, guess where the high crime areas on your predictive policing map are going to be, right? They're going to be the places you've been policing all the time because that's where you've been finding all the crime. So we're just taking old biases in terms of what we think is an important crime to police and what neighborhoods we think are bad, and we're just sort of importing them into a new system because that's the data we had to begin with. But secondly, he explains that a lot of the data used in predictive policing systems is based on police encounters that were illegal in and of themselves. So he says a 2017 Freedom of Information Act request of the Chicago Police Department revealed that their predictive policing data set included 398,684 individuals, with much of the information having to do with arrests and not convictions, right? He also notes that 13 jurisdictions had used or were planning to use predictive policing systems that were feeding the system's data, including unconstitutional and racially biased stops, searches, and arrests, right? And so if you take illegal stops, right, and if you take a long history of choosing to police, for example, a predominantly African-American neighborhood, and you feed that to a system and say, tell us where the crime is, well, it's going to tell you that the crime is where you found the crime in the past, especially if you're not even filtering it through to only look at convictions, right? If you're just looking at arrests, it's very easy to, in many cases, arrest someone or stop someone. If it hasn't been filtered through the criminal justice process, that's just even more bias. And there's a couple of impacts from this argument. One impact is just to kind of generically show just how Orwellian and rigged the predictive policing system is. And I do like that term rigged, right? It is rigged because it relies on a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? This is where the crime has been before, so the system is going to tell us this is where the crime is now, right? And that's especially true when you're looking at samples that don't filter things out, right? But the second impact, and I really like this kind of nifty idea, is the idea of tech washing, right? Tech washing is a term that's used by Kate Crockford of ACLU back in 2016. And what it basically says is look, most people in society know that most people in society know that racial bias in policing is bad, right? Or at least many people do. We're starting to come around and accept that shouldn't happen. But what happens is when you take these long histories of policing certain neighborhoods and then you begin to filter them through these algorithms, what it does is it sort of whitewashes the racism away. You say, oh, well, it's neutral. I mean, we're just going where the computer tells us to go. We're not engaging in hunches or guesses. There's no room for bias. It's just, what the computer tells us. And you and I as debaters may know that that's not true because the data is garbage, right? It's biased based on the prior biases of the police department. But people out there in public don't, necessarily know that, and they will begin to believe that, there's no problem here. Now, unfortunately, there aren't any really good empirics, I think, for, showing that this is happening, but as an intuitive argument that we're putting a smiley face, a neutral face, a tech-friendly face on an insidious process, is not a bad one. Another argument I think that's really important, and you certainly could pair this up with the idea of an individual theory, right, is just the idea that actions based on likelihoods and predictions can never be just, even if they are effective, right? And this certainly pairs up with one of the justice theories we talked about earlier, which is individual desert, right? Justice means, the most common definition of justice that we read in Lincoln Douglas rounds, if you probably know what it is, right? It's justice means giving each person their due. Sometimes justice means giving each person their due under the circumstances, right? Well, their due, for it to be meaningful at all, has to be based on them, right? What they've done, what they've actually, the behavior they've engaged in. And when a police action is based on predictions about what you might do, based on masses of data that are so big that one human being can't even comprehend them, that's not based on your action. That's treating you as a probability. That's treating you as a statistic, right? So that is an inherently unjust idea. We don't even need to get to what the effects are, Judge. It's just unjust because it treats people like data bits, right? Even if it were, you could even say this. You could even say the phrase, Judge, even if my opponent proves that it's incredibly effective and wonderful and great for society, that doesn't matter because the resolution doesn't say effective. The resolution doesn't say it works. The resolution says just or unjust. And this is unjust to treat people as fungible units in an equation or an algorithm, right? You could say, look, Judge, I mean, if we wanted to talk about efficiency, well, we could just go into the prisons and summarily execute all of our serious convicted criminals, right? It would save us money on keeping them there. The ones who might get out, they would have zero chance at recidivism. Overall, you'd be executing a certain number of people, but maybe society as a whole would be better off. That's what utilitarianism might tell you. It's kind of a caricature of utilitarianism, right? But that might be effective, but it wouldn't be just, right? And it might be effective to go around profiling people and using data to predict that all this crime is happening in these neighborhoods, but don't call it justice. In other words, Judge, you call it whatever you want, but don't call it justice. It is unjust. That's a powerful argument, and it sort of sidesteps a lot of the things that the negative can say about why it might be good. So I kind of like that as one potential idea for how to handle the AF. Last thing I have on the app is the idea that predictive policing has the potential to circumvent certain legal protections, right? And the basic idea here is that the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution requires an individualized assessment of what a person is doing, right? How they're behaving before police can stop them and intervene. It's usually called probable cause if you're going to arrest them, but sometimes it's called reasonable suspicion if you just want to stop them briefly and maybe do a frisk. But regardless, it's always got to be based on what an individual person is doing, right? But what if a person shows up as a possible suspect according to the algorithm on a predictive policing unit, right? Or if they live in a neighborhood that the algorithm or the AI has identified as being a high crime area. Well, are these factors that can be weighed by the police? Well, typically, the way that reasonable suspicion and probable cause works is you can stack up different factors together. You can pretty much look at anything that might be relevant, even if by itself it wouldn't be enough. And so police will say, look, I saw this guy, he was standing there, he was looking at a house, he was wearing a dark hoodie, right? And oh, by the way, in addition to that, the predictive policing system told us that this neighborhood and this particular area of this neighborhood was likely to have a lot of burglaries, and I just thought this guy looked like a burglar, so I went and stopped him. And there are going to be judges who absolutely buy that and go along with that and allow that, right? And so what you're going to effectively be doing is putting a thumb on the scale and saying that, if you are in the wrong part of town that the algorithm has said is the bad part of town, right? If you are, frankly, an individual who has been profiled, whether you committed a crime or not, right? Whether you're doing anything wrong at the time or not, then there's going to be a little bit of extra, weight given to the police's claim that they can stop you, that they can interrogate you, that they can do things to take up your time. And that's not fair, right? Because it's not based on justice. It's not based on anything you actually did. The Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect you unless police have probable cause based on what you've done. And in this case, that's not the case. And so there's a good background article from Emory that we will link to. The specific card that I'd look to is from Patel in 2015, writing in the New York Times. And what it says is, at a time of rising concern about over-policing in minority communities, surging police to particular locations may have its own compounding negative consequences. Technology that purports to zero in on categories of people likely to commit crimes is even more suspect. It undermines the constitutional requirement that police should target people based on individual suspicion and wrongdoing, not statistical probability. So we're going to turn justice, right? Literally in the Fourth Amendment sense, the most relevant sense for our physical freedom to walk around in the world, we're going to turn it into a question, at least in part, of does the machine tell us that you are potentially a bad guy? And that's really, really troubling. So with that, we'll move on and talk a little bit about some good strategies, I think, on the negative side of the fence. Okay, so on the negative, I think one really good overarching strategy is something that I in the past have called the Immanuel Kant "it depends" argument on the negative, which is the basic idea that whatever the object of evaluation in the resolution is, you cannot assign it a moral status as the resolution requires, because it is simply a tool, right? It is a tool that can be used for good or bad. Sometimes this is called the tool in a toolbox negative, whatever you want to say about it. The idea is that things like predictive policing technologies do not have any inherent moral status. The idea is the affirmative has a duty of assigning a moral status to essentially an inanimate object. I mean, it's an algorithm, it's a set of practices, but it's kind of like an inanimate object, right? And the idea would be that, for example, a hammer, right? A hammer can be used for good or bad. A hammer can be used to build a habitat house for a low-income person, or it can be used to murder someone in cold blood, right? And the fact that even if hammers were being used very frequently to do a lot of murdering of people with, no one would refer to hammers as being unjust. They would refer to the people that use them badly as being unjust. So we might say that certain police departments that use this improperly are unjust, but nobody calls the tool unjust. A tool is not something that has the capacity to be, to have that moral status. Guns are the same thing, right? A gun can be used to kill a person in cold blood, an innocent person, or it can be used to guard, like, a bank, or guard a store, or guard, supplies for refugees or something along those lines, good or bad. We don't assign it moral status. And this is true even if in the majority of cases right now it's being used for bad, right? So for example, even if we said like most guns currently are being used to do bad things in the United States, that's not true, but even if it were, we just wouldn't refer to a gun as unjust. And you cannot refer to an inanimate object or an inanimate concept like predictive policing as being unjust. And I think the way you want to sort of run this is you can start with Immanuel Kant, and you can say that Kant requires, that in order for something to be a true statement, it has to be, a universalizable maxim. And we simply cannot universalize the maxim that predictive policing is unjust. It's just not always unjust. There are exceptions to that, right? And all you've got to do is go and find, a handful of exceptions and show, look, there's some cases where we can use predictive policing and it works just fine. So for example, Albert Major in 2019 has a good article where he's actually kind of on the fence about whether predictive policing works at all. And it's a good article to read generally because it talks about how little consensus there is in the data. So for your background, I would read the Major article, but he has a couple of good quotes throughout it of like good things that predictive policing is doing. So for example, for instance, with the use of historical data, Richmond, Virginia's police department tried to forecast where gun firings would occur on New Year's Eve. People just shoot guns up in the air. Those of you who are not from the South, like we are, this is the thing, right? This is something people do. I live outside of the municipal area. It happens a lot. So in 2003, they adapted their surveillance routes based on predictions from predictive policing, and it was a success. The random gunfire decreased by 47%, 246% more weapons were seized, and the police force was more efficient, with saving about $15,000 of taxpayer money that night. And the idea is, if you're keeping like loud noises from keeping people awake, if you're keeping people from having illegal guns out on the street, if you're keeping bullets from potentially flying up and coming back down and hurting or killing somebody, well, who could object to that, right? So you can give an anecdote like that. You can also look to studies that suggest that overall predictive policing does reduce crime. So for example, there's Levin et al. 2017. They did a pretty rigorous analysis of the New York Police Department's Domain Awareness System, or DAS, and they found that it saved $50 million per year. And when it was deployed department-wide in 2013, the overall crime index for the city fell by 6%, not entirely due to DAS, but it probably did contribute to that. And the argument would be, if at least in some of these places we are using it to, do things like saving money and being more efficient, right, then we should treat it like what it is, which is a morally neutral tool, and judge no matter how many horror stories my opponent lines up for you on the other side. If I'm showing you that there are good cases and they're showing you that there are bad cases, then this thing, and it is a thing, right? It's an algorithm on a computer somewhere, is not just or unjust. It's a thing. It's morally neutral. And if it's morally neutral, I as the negative should win the round, right? That's the argument. A second, I think equally strong argument for the negative is the the idea that bias is inevitable, and at least predictive policing may make it somewhat more transparent and correctable. So one key question I think the negative can ask of the affirmative in a lot of rounds is when they're talking about all the bad things that happen or allegedly will happen with predictive policing, they can ask, how is this different from the status quo? Did this not happen in the status quo? If they're talking about racial bias or profiling, or if they're talking about systemic racism, or if they're talking about, sort of picking on certain neighborhoods and things like that, didn't that happen before? Didn't that happen, over the decades? And the answer is, of course it did. There are good articles by like Hassett Walker 2019 on how race and class shaped the behavior of police as far back as the 19th century. We'll put those in as just sort of general background. In the 1960s and 70s, you saw the rise of stop and frisk policing, where departments tried to prevent crime by stopping anyone that officers deemed suspicious, right? And the Supreme Court said in Terry versus Ohio in 1968, you don't even need probable cause to do that. You just need reasonable suspicion to stop someone, frisk them. So guess what? And we've got articles on this and, notes on this. Departments started overwhelmingly stopping young black men, or certainly young men, but overwhelmingly young black men got stopped a lot. Why? Because there was, bias and there was racism, among folks who were doing it, right? In the early 80s, you saw the rise of broken windows policing theory, right? Something that the very recently departed from the campaign, Michael Bloomberg, was a proponent of, right? It says that you need to focus police efforts on areas that see petty crimes like vandalism and vagrancy and public drunkenness. And these were more common in lower income areas, which also tended to be more diverse areas. So this has been going on forever, right? There's tons of literature that says this bias has been infiltrating policing for a long, long time, right? With predictive policing algorithms, we concede that it doesn't get rid of the bias, but it also doesn't cause the bias, right? But here's the unique advantage. At least with an algorithm that's on a computer that like gives different weight to different functions, like it looks at prior convictions and it looks at, the physical proximity of crimes and the types of crimes, and it has this really complicated formula, right? That's what an algorithm is. If it's giving too much weight, for example, to petty property crimes or low-level drug crimes, and that's not fair or that's not good or that's not right, we can take that algorithm apart, right? The police department can go in and look at that algorithm, right? They can look at what it says. We can open it up to the public, right? And look at it. And they can figure out what's wrong with it. You can't do that with the hunches and the biases and the racism that might be present in individual officials. Back in the 70s and 80s, you can't go back and look inside their head and take apart their thought process and put it back together. But you can do that with predictive policing. So if it's messing up, it's not messing up in a way that's any worse than what we had before, right? And as we're going to talk about in just a second, it may actually be slightly better on some of these fronts, right? But at least you can be transparent with it. And so there's an article from Sutherland in 2018 writing for the ACLU, and it actually recommends what you could kind of call as sort of a counter plan or counter advocacy. And it says we should start using an algorithmic impact assessment, or AIA, right, on all predictive policing that allows outsiders to go in and audit the algorithm and look and see, like, how is it biased? How does it weigh, like, bias things too much? And to fix it, essentially, right? And Bakke 2018 has a good survey of the arguments for transparency in predictive policing. So there is literature out there about this. I'll be candid with you, it's not happening a lot in the status quo. So you do have to, fight that argument over over the present tense, and basically say that, this could happen, right? This is a possibility for the future. It's an advocacy that can happen. And what it means is that it is not inherently unjust, right? So I think that is another good option, which is to say, look, of course bias is bad, but bias has been with us since the beginning of time. Predictive policing at least gives us a chance to sort of audit and scrutinize it in a way that you couldn't when the audit was just, when the bias was just a hunch in the police chief's brain, right? A third possibility, and I think this is the last one I have, but I think it's very, very important, is that predictive policing doesn't actually hurt communities of color. Now, of course, this is a very fraught line of argumentation, but honestly, as the negative, I don't think you can just sort of concede the idea that communities of color and historically disenfranchised folks are always going to be hurt by it. If you concede that, you're going to be in for a very difficult time in the debate, right? Obviously, yes, there's been a history of really bad racism and policing in this country, but it's not clear at all draw from the data that predictive policing is making the problem worse. And that's what you need to be looking at, Judge. Is this tool making it worse, or is it simply maybe not fixing the whole problem? So Branningham et al. In 2017 have a really good article that says, there's obviously, it admits there's reasonable concern that predictive algorithms encourage police patrols to target minority communities with discriminatory consequences. However, to date, there have been no empirical studies on the bias of predictive algorithms used for police patrols. Here, we test such biases using arrest data from the LA Police Department and their predictive policing experiments. We find there were no significant differences in the proportion of arrests by racial ethnic group between the control and the treatment conditions. In other words, between when you're using predictive policing and when you're not. We find that the total numbers of arrests at the division level declined. Total number declined or remained unchanged during predictive policing deployments. Arrests were numerically higher at the algorithmically predicted locations, but when adjusted for overall crime rates, they were lower. So all this to say is, like, when we actually try to empirically test the question, and I'm sure there's more data out there, and we'll see if we can drop a little bit more in there. Again, please forgive us for our limited time. There is evidence out there that says you might think that the bias is the fault of predictive policing, but the truth is it's not really. It may even slightly lower the number of arrests overall, which might be good for communities that are historically over-policed and sort of scrutinized very carefully by police. It might or it might not. But the point is, you can't just concede this, right? You have to fight back on it. You may not ultimately win it, but if you can fight back on it, that gives you a lot stronger, position to say, see, Judge, it's really a difficult, case by case basis. You have to look at each predictive policing model and method on its own merits, and you have to concede that in a few places it might not be harmful. It might even be helpful. And once you agree with that, we go back to the first argument right at the very beginning where we said of the negative, where we say, so you can't assign it a moral status. You can't say that it's unjust. It's an inanimate object. It's just a tool in the toolbox, right? So that's it for the negative. Let's do some final thoughts. So on final thoughts, just really quickly, I think this is something, again, just going back to the initial arguments, the points we made before, you've got to be super sensitive. You got to be careful about how you talk about issues of race and class and things like that. You also don't want to be unduly critical of individual police officers. We're talking about systemic racism here. This is definitely something where it is entirely possible to get completely bogged down in the weeds. There are a half dozen major predictive policing systems, and because of the brevity of this video, we didn't really have time to get into them, but you can certainly research them out there. There are many, many concepts like machine learning and algorithms that you need to know. And even if you know them, condensing them down into 6 and 7 minute and shorter speeches is tough, especially where a judge has never heard of this before, right? They've heard of some of your topics, but not this one. So it's going to be really important to have what I call sort of the Gordian knot cutting argument. The Gordian knot being the knot that was so complicated that the only way to undo it was to just chop it with a sword. And that's why I'm trying to give you some of these sort of more straightforward arguments, like you can't assign a moral status to an inanimate object. That's the kind of straightforward narrative you need. Yes, be ready to fight on the particulars. Yes, know as much as you can. Have good data. It's out there. You absolutely can find it. But at the end of the day, for many, many judges, right, especially in your sort of more traditional circuits, at your NSD national qualifiers and things like that, at your state championship tournaments, which is where a lot of y'all are going to be this month, they're going to want a simple narrative. So you can't assign a moral status, right? Those kind of things. Or, hey, they've got all the data. If they can't prove that it works, you should assume that it doesn't, right? Things like that are going to be very helpful at the end of close debates, and which is why we focused on it. So again, thank you so much for watching this month. Please forgive us for being super busy. Hopefully this was useful to you. We'll be back in full force on our next one. Until then, I hope you guys have a great March. Hope you have a great spring. Really had a good year doing LD with you guys. So without further ado, we'll close with our usual debate is for everybody. So make sure you work hard, have fun, and hail state.